I nearly drowned 2 weeks ago, and it changed my life. My family moved out to Mercy Shores recently. It's a little peninsula down in Washington, with 2 hardware stores, a Walmart, and not much else. Mom and Dad grew up in San Diego, amongst the hustle and bustle of city life, and decided they wanted to retire somewhere a little quieter. I had been their last child, a total surprise to both of them at 40. Now that they were 55, they felt it was time to retire and enjoy their golden years. So they moved me 400 miles away from my friends, my school, and anyone I had ever known, so they could enjoy those golden years. We moved into a beach house of sorts. It was a 2-story, the second floor a loft that overlooked the ocean out of a big round bay window. They gave me the loft and took a larger room downstairs with a less spectacular view, knowing I was not happy about leaving my friends behind. I guess my parents were trying to placate me, so I set up my meager possessions that I had brought with us, the moving truck being a couple of days behind. As I set about finding a home for things, I found myself drawn to the big bay window that overlooked our little stretch of beach. The shore was far from picturesque. Not quite as pretty as the California beaches, Mercy Shore was stony and a little bleak looking. I didn't doubt the water would be cold and clear, but it would also likely have rocks, and maybe crabs scuttling underfoot. There was a tall jut of rock just off the coast, about 50 feet from the shore. I found my gaze drawn there again and again. It looked like nothing so much as a tall throne, fit for a giant. The seat was smooth from many tides. I almost thought I could see a little hollow in the back of the throne. The throne wasn't quite large enough for caves, but there was a narrow fluted passage in the throne's back that would likely fill with water when the waves crushed over it. Those waves woke me up that first night. The crashing of the breakers jarred me awake. I realized that they were so loud because I'd left the window open. As I slid it shut, my eyes were caught by the moon as it cast its glow on the stone throne. As I closed the window, I saw something moving in the water. The lean shape crested up and out of the water like a sea serpent, and as it came up, I could see it was a girl. Her hair was long and silvery and lovely. She ran her fingers through it as I stared at her, and she seemed to feel my gaze as she floated like a specter in the dark water. She looked up at me, her smile wide and inviting, and waved a single pale hand at my window. I waved back, and when she slipped under the water this time, she didn't come back up. When I woke up the next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The next day, Mom and Dad wanted to go antiquing in town. I told them I didn't want to go, and they didn't act too put out by my refusal. It was pretty clear they didn't want a complaining teen tagging along and ruining their trip. I waved to them from the front porch as they left before moving upstairs to relax a little. I sat in the window seat of my new room, reading and watching the waves crash, when I saw some people walking down with blankets and coolers. They started setting up their stuff, and I noticed most of them looked around my age. On a whim, I decided to talk to them. What was the worst that could happen? I slipped on a pair of comfy shorts and headed out. The beachgoers tensed when they saw the door open, but they relaxed a little when they realized I wasn't an adult. I introduced myself and learned that they were Matt, Stuart, Kyle, and Roger. They had apparently been coming to this beach for quite a while and said it was a favorite hangout spot for them. Sorry for intruding. Throne Beach has been empty for years, and the old lady who used to live here always let us play here when we were kids, Matt explained. Matt looked like he'd be at home on any California beach. Board shorts, long brown hair cut in that way that's half bowl cut and half natural, a surfboard next to his blanket, and a smile for anyone. Stuart was tall, gangly almost, with buck teeth and thick glasses. He was very pale, and I got the impression that they had dragged him out from under a rock to hang out with his friends. Kyle and Roger looked like a couple of classic Chads. Snap brim hats, sculpted physiques, gold chains, board shorts, the works. They slapped my hand when I went to shake theirs and roared with laughter when I looked a little confused. We became friends in that effortless way teens often do. I hung out with them for the rest of the day. We swam, the water was cold and stony, as I had thought it would be, and played frisbee with a big red disc that Roger had brought. I invited them in for lunch, and we sat on the blankets and munched cold sandwiches and chips. The sun was starting to work its way across the sky as we ate. I noticed that mine wasn't the only eye drawn to the big rock out there. Matt was studying it intently as he ate, and it almost seemed like he was looking for something out there. "It's pretty cool," I said, taking a bite of bologna as he looked over at me. "The rock, I mean." Matt nodded. "Oh, Matt just thinks it's cool because he thought he saw a girl out there," Roger crowed. Matt shot him a murderous look, but I was interested. "A girl?" Matt blew out a big long breath. "Well, it happened a few years ago. I was out here swimming with Kyle and Roger, and the waves were a little rougher than I thought they were. We had all been daring each other to swim out to the rock and back. We had all done it since we were young. I was on my way back, and a huge wave crashed over me and drove me under. I kicked my legs and tried to right myself, but the waves kept crashing down. I was underwater, running out of air, and as my lungs cried out, I felt hands catch me. Someone lifted me and swam me to the shore. I was on my knees, hacking up water and struggling for breath. I looked back at the water and saw a girl swimming away. Kyle and Roger came running up then, and when I looked back, she was gone." Kyle snickered, but I was curious. "What did she look like?" "She had long hair, maybe blonde or silver. She looked young. I remember thinking that she was about my age. Her hands felt strong but cold, and I've been keeping an eye out for her ever since. I keep hoping maybe she'll come back." His eyes glazed over a little then, and he stared back at the throne-shaped rock hopefully. I heard my dad honk the horn on his old truck then, and my new friends turned to see my parents coming up the drive. They had some furniture in the back of the pickup. As Dad got out, he called me over to help him move it. I said my goodbyes and went to help, but found all four of them following behind me to my surprise. We had the furniture inside faster than expected between the five of us, and I introduced them to my parents. Mom asked if they'd like to stay for dinner, holding up a takeout Chinese food bag. "I can get some more. The place next to the antique shop smelled so good that I just had to have some." "Maybe another time, ma'am. We don't want to intrude," Matt said. He held his hands up, and I slapped it as he promised that they would see me tomorrow and see if I wanted to hang out. They cleaned up their stuff, and after another round of goodbyes, they hopped on their bikes and rolled into town. Mom smiled. "Making friends already, I see." I smiled back, realizing I had done just that. We sat around the table and ate as they told me about their day. My parents talked about the antiquing. The stores in town had a large selection, and Mom was in love with several other pieces. I told them about my new friends, and they agreed that they seemed like nice boys. I told them how lovely the beach was, and Mom said she had gotten a call from the movers saying that they would be here tomorrow afternoon with the stuff. "Maybe your friends would like to help you set up your room?" she asked. Turned out, they did. I spent that summer hanging out with my new friends. We had moved at the very end of school, and next year I would be starting 10th grade at Mercy Shores High. Matt, Stuart, Kyle, and Roger would be starting 10th grade as well. We had many of the same classes, and as the summer slipped away, Matt proposed one last beach day to celebrate the end of summer. "It's the last really warm day before fall, and we should take advantage of it." It was a great day. The sun was hot, the wind was breezy. Dad had set up a grill and was cooking hot dogs and hamburgers. Mom had found the badminton set, and we were using it to play volleyball. Mom agreed to play with us, to round the teams out, and she turned out to be really good at it. Roger, Stuart, and my mom creamed Kyle, Matt, and I 3-5, and we decided to swim a little after that. We took to the water like a school of fish, and Kyle suggested we swim to the rock. "Come on, Kyle, let's not," Matt protested. "What's the matter, Matt? You chicken?" Kyle teased. "I'll race you," I said, starting to swim for the rock as Kyle cawed angrily and lit out after me. You don't realize it from the shore, but the rock is pretty far out. It was about 30 feet from the beach, and you just don't really realize it till you're there. I had swum to the rock before, we all had, but it's never the same trip twice. I swam hard, tearing up the surf as I went, and when I got to the rock, my arms were burning. I hung to the side of the rock like a barnacle, catching my breath as Kyle closed the distance. When he was about 3 feet away, I dove back into the water and started swimming hard for the shore. I heard him yell, but I ignored him, paddling hard as I made for my friends who were bobbing near the beach. That was when something grabbed my leg. At first, I thought it was a fish that had just wandered too close, and I kicked my foot out to shoo it. When it wrapped its squishy hands around my leg again, though, it tugged me down with a strength I hadn't felt before. I was pulled under the water, dragged beneath the waves, and as I went below, I felt the air rush out of me in surprise. I kicked out, but whatever had me was fast. it dodged out of the way of my kicks and continued to drag me into the blackness below. I opened my eyes, trying to see what it was, and I was transfixed for a moment. It was a girl. It was the girl. Her hair plumed around her like a halo, and as she noticed me noticing her, she smiled at me. For a moment, it seemed like her mouth was too full of teeth, rows of needles that gleamed in the murky depths. She tugged me down, but now I very much did not want to go. I kicked again, but I was losing focus. I needed air. I was losing consciousness. As the blackness swam up before my eyes, I thought for sure I was going to drown. Then, something grabbed me under my arms and tugged me free. The next thing I was aware of was someone giving me CPR as I coughed and gurgled on the beach. Mom's face swam before me, and she smiled in relief as I came back. I sat up, still coughing, and heard someone in the water yelling for Matt. Kyle was beside me, apologizing profusely as I choked out the last of the water. I looked around and saw that Stuart was yelling at Matt as he dived under again and again, searching for something. I coughed up some water. What's wrong with Matt? Kyle looked out and sighed. He went out to save you. He dove to get you, but he came up talking about a girl he'd seen. He said she had you by the leg, and after he put you on the beach, he went out to find her again. Dad called the festivities shortly after that. Kyle and Roger hauled Matt out of the water, and the four left after saying goodbye and telling me that they were glad I was okay. Matt didn't say much of anything. He looked dazed and confused, and kept looking back at the water as they led him back to the bikes. I knew how he felt. I found myself drawn to the water after that. If I had a spare moment, or even if I didn't, I would sit by the water and listen to the waves. I couldn't get her out of my head, that beautiful creature that had grabbed me. Why had she grabbed me, I wondered. She had seemed intent on showing me something underwater. Did she want me to see something, maybe? Matt started coming around a lot more. Not to see me, not really, but I think he wanted to be close to the water too. I caught him down by the water at night sometimes, sitting by the shore or sitting by the beach. He never brought anything. He was always just sitting in the sand and staring at the water. Dad came out and shooed him more than once, and he told me to tell Matt not to sit out there at night a few days later. He could get hurt out there, and I don't want to call the cops on him for trespassing. That was the night I heard the whispery voice coming from the beach. It came through my window and seduced my ears to wakefulness. I sat up, listening, hearing a returning voice that was much less musical. It was no less familiar, though. When I looked out on the beach, I saw that Matt was on the shore and talking with someone. The someone was in the water, and by the sound of it, they were trying to coax him into the water with them. He looked back towards the road, his bike a shadowy hulk on the street, and then again at the speaker. He said something too low for me to hear, and when they returned to that sweet honey sound, he walked into the water, and I heard him splashing as he dove. I ran from my room and went softly down the stairs. I was worried about him. He was a strong swimmer, but the waters at night were likely dangerous. I came out onto the beach, whispering his name so as not to wake my folks up. I went to the edge of the water and scanned the dark ocean for him, but he was nowhere to be found. He had been there only a moment before, hadn't he? I spent a few minutes searching for him before finally heading inside, thinking maybe I'd been dreaming or something. That was when I heard the voice. "Hello, handsome." I turned back to the water. I'd heard a feminine voice speak, heard it plain as day, but all I could see was the black waves as they churned endlessly. It was dark out there, too dark, and I didn't think that anything could exist out there in that blackness. "Not leaving already, are you?" the voice asked again. It was closer now, and when I looked, I saw a silver-haired girl sitting on the shoreline. It was the same one as before. She was dressed in a green dress, the color of seaweed. Her hair was long and silver and hung wild around her, shimmering wetly in the moonlight. Her skin was like porcelain, so white and flawless, and her face looked like a carved mask made of flesh. Her hands were on her knees, and when she turned, she smiled at me with the most beautiful set of perfect white teeth. She was breathtaking, the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and as she tugged at my legs, trying to get me to sit, I did. "What brings you here so late?" she asked in her whispery voice. I thought my friend was here." "No one here but me and you." Her silvery hair danced in the moonlight as she shook her head. "I saw you the first night I moved in here," I said, not knowing why. She nodded. I wanted to say hello, and now it seems I have. I don't know how long I sat there, but it was the best night of my life. We talked for hours about nothing at all. She absorbed every word I said, and I basked in her ephemeral beauty. She was a goddess, her skin lacking blemishes or faults, her hair a perfect sheet of silver. We talked until the sun came up, and I remember her looking at it and giving it a little hiss. Come see me tonight, handsome, she said sweetly. Wait, where are you going? Home. I'll be back tonight. Then she kissed me, and my whole world trembled on the edge of breaking as her lips pressed against mine. When I came back to myself, I was lying on the beach. Matt's parents showed up the next day around lunch. Matt had apparently been missing since last night. They were worried about him because he hadn't been acting like himself lately. He hadn't been eating well, his sleep had been fitful, and they had often woken up to find him gone at night. Matt's father had found him on our beach many times, curled up in the sand, and they had hoped they'd find him here today. My parents said they hadn't seen him, and I said the same. It wasn't a lie. I hadn't seen him after all. I'd seen the girl, the most beautiful moon child, but any thoughts of my friend had fled my mind after that. They left to see the sheriff, and Mom bemoaned the luck. She asked if I was sure I hadn't seen him last night, and I said that I hadn't. After lunch, I went up and took a nap. I wanted to be fresh for her tonight. I met with her every night that week. I came up after sundown to find her sprawling on the beach waiting for me. We talked for hours, locked in each other's eyes. Her face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and she seemed to hang on my every word. Thinking back, I don't think she spoke much at all. She wanted to hear about my life, my friends, my hobbies, books I'd read, and anything else that mattered to me. She always left at sunrise, kissing me and leaving me dazed and confused. In town, Matt's disappearance was big news. The sheriff had talked to us a few times, wondering if any of us had seen him. The state police were searching everywhere. Every friend he'd ever had, anyone who could have any contact with him, and every place he might have been was searched and searched again. Knowing him to be a swimmer, they were scuba divers combing the ocean, but their hopes were low of finding him if he'd gone into the water. I was in a daze. My waking thoughts were of the girl, the lovely girl, and when I would see her again. Kyle tried to get me to come looking for Matt with them, but I was always too tired. Mom wanted to take me school shopping, but school just didn't interest me. I was in love, I was in lust, and I wanted nothing but my porcelain goddess forever. My haze held until one day when they found Matt. Kyle came slamming into my room, rousing me from sleep and saying we had to go. What? Kyle, it's too early. I want to sleep. It's 12:30, dude. Get up and come with me now. He threw clothes at me as I groggily got out of bed. What's your damage, man? Why the sudden rush? We found him. My blood ran cold. You found Matt? What's left of him? Stewart's got the sheriff, and Roger's staying with the body. I need you to come say your goodbyes before the media circus hits. If you even want to say goodbye. I put my shirt on, glaring at him owlishly. What's that supposed to mean? Kyle glared at me. You're acting just like him before he disappeared. You don't want to hang out. You don't even want to help us look for him. So I'm assuming that you already knew he was missing. I don't like what you're insinuating, I said, starting to get angry. You seemed like a good guy when you first moved to town, but now I'm not so sure. You know something. Maybe not all of it, but you know something. Now either come with me or don't, but either way, it's the last time you're ever going to see him. It's also the last time I want to see you. I got dressed and followed him. Matt, it turned out, had washed up on the beach about 5 miles from my house. Well, what was left of him had washed up. His arms and legs were picked over stumps. His eyes and nose were gone, ditto for his lips and ears. If he hadn't still been wearing the t-shirt that Roger had given him for his birthday a year before, no one would have known it was him. He was a torso, picked over from head to toe. When we got there, Stewart and Roger were nearby, both of them crying. The sheriff had shunted the two boys away, and as we approached, he raised a hand to stop us. No closer, boys. I appreciate you finding the body, but I need you to stand back. Kyle told the sheriff how they had found the body while riding along the road. We were going to the corner store when we saw him. We thought he was a dolphin that had been washed up until we saw the t-shirt. That's when we came to get you. The ambulance came and took the body away. I remember looking at him under that white sheet and still being able to see his eyeless face. I realized I'd been living in a cloud the whole time. I needed to find out what had happened that night, and only one person knew for sure. After dark, I went to find her. She lay waiting for me, the same as always, but when I didn't sit, she seemed worried. "What's wrong, handsome? You seem upset." I took a deep breath. "What happened to Matt the night we met?" "Who?" she asked, but her voice didn't seem right. "My friend, Matt. I think you'd been talking to him, just like this, before he died. I think he went into the water after you that night, and now his body is sitting in the morgue, half eaten." I took a step back from her. "Handsome, I don't know who this person is. Why don't you come sit with me? You can tell me all about them." She patted the sand, and for a moment I saw a hand the color of algae. I saw a hand with webbed fingers. She must have noticed, because the hand was normal again just that fast. I took another step back. "Why did you save him all those years ago? Why did you save him from drowning if you were just going to kill him?" She looked down, her hair making a sheet in front of her face. "He wasn't ready yet." That sent a shiver through me. Ready? Ready for what? When she looked back up, her face had changed. Her eyes were like onyx stones. Her nose had become a snake's slit. Her teeth were rows of sewing needles, and her grin looked ready to split her full rotten lips. The dress wasn't a dress. It was her shimmering scales, and as she moved, I could see a tail like a carp's attached to her. Her whispery voice was now like a hook dragged across a rock. "We needed his seed. Our men are gone. There's no one to hunt for us. We must make some more. We have to create the next generation." My feet were moving backwards now. "You killed him for his... We needed his seed. We needed his meat. Once we were done, we gave him back," she said, her teeth fixed in a lazy grin. "I don't want to see you anymore," I said. "You're not the person I thought you were." I was 12 feet away, but I heard her final words on the subject. "You can't turn from me, boy. I swim in your veins now. You can't deny me any more than he could." She was right. Even as I walked away, wanting to run, I felt my feet trying to go back to her. I had to make myself go inside. I had to make myself go into my room. I had to make myself close the curtains and try to resist the urge to go back to the beach. Writing this helped, but I can't stop thinking about her, even with my mind so distracted. She's never a monster in my memories. When I think of her, she's always the porcelain moonchild I met on the beach. She's always the sweet girl whose lips were sweeter still. She's always the subject of my infatuation. I peeked out my window several times. She's out on the rock, sitting on the throne, singing to me. Her song is for me alone, and I know that I will go to her despite my best efforts. Even now, I feel like a swim. Even now, I feel myself wanting to swim to her. Even now, I feel myself wanting to see what she has to show me in the deeps. We have to stop this. All of this. We have to stop writing, we have to stop reading, and we have to stop spreading these things around. As I sit here in my one-bedroom apartment, I can feel him looking at me. He's closer now. I can see him pacing in the corner. When he sees what I'm writing, I'm not sure what will happen. I've been writing these stories, these things, for so long. I've polluted the world with this filth, but I'm done. These stories, these abominations have ruined my life, like no drug or drink ever could. After tonight, though, I guess I'll never have to think about them again. I don't want you to think it's always been this way. I haven't always been a worthless waste of space. I was married once. I was married to an amazing woman who loved me. We had a little boy. We had a new house. I had a job that I loved. We had friends. We went out. We had a life together. That was before I found the creepypastas. I've always been a fan of horror films, horror comics, horror stories, pretty much anything scary. I remember when I was 6, I watched The Shining with my mom. While I didn't sleep at all that night, I remember relishing the squirming feeling that lived in my guts. From that day forward, I was hooked. I watched anything and everything. Even cheesy films like Paranormal Activity or The Haunting of Sunshine Girls seemed to pique my adrenaline. The darker the movie, the more it appealed to me. I guess that's why I liked them so much. If I was afraid, then my adrenaline was pumping, and it made me feel more alert, more alive. Horror movies are how I met my wife, Lisa. We were both standing in line at the midnight showing of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and began talking about horror movies as we waited to get our tickets. By the time we got inside, her friends had called to cancel, and I invited her to come sit with me. She was so cute, but turned out to be a total scaredy cat. She spent most of the movie hiding her eyes and squeezing my hand during the best parts. I didn't mind, though. I think I was in love by the end of that movie. 6 months later, we moved in together. To my surprise, we meshed well together. We didn't have the usual arguments over dinner or the division of chores. The house was brighter with her in it, and on our first anniversary, I proposed to her, and we made it official. My one-bedroom condo, our one-bedroom condo, I guess, was fine for a while, but when she told me she was pregnant, I knew it was time to find a bigger place. I do IT work for a pretty big company, so money for a house wasn't too big of an issue. With our modest incomes, we were able to get a nice 3-bedroom house in the city, and I put my condo up for rent. When our son was born, I thought it was the happiest day of my life. For a while, we were the picture of a happy family. Little did I know how quickly that would end. About 2.5 years ago, just as my son turned 2, a friend of mine told me about a new game on Steam called Five Nights at Freddy's. He knew I liked horror games, and he bought it for me as a late birthday present. I gave it a thorough playthrough, and though it was kind of cheesy, I felt like it was still an okay experience. The game, however, opened up a door I wished I'd left closed. I was so taken with the mystery of the game, the Bite of 82, the animatronics, the missing children, and it led me to search online for more info. That's how I stumbled across the creepypastas. They were great. How had I never seen these before? They were terrifying in a way I hadn't seen in years. I started with a classic, 1999, which was recommended because of the main character from the FNAF games, a giant bear. From the first time I read the story, I felt like there was something about it, something different. It prickled the hairs on the back of my neck, to be sure, but it also felt like something was watching me. I shrugged it off, just that scared feeling, like when you watch a really intense horror movie, and for a day or so afterwards you feel on edge. I spent the next few months engrossed in any creepypasta I could find. Jeff the Killer, Slender Man Legends, Smile Dog, Candle Cove, that one was one of my favorites, The Blue Man, all the SCPs. After a while, I'm ashamed to say that they became a bit of a mania in me, and I absorbed anything that I could lay my hands on. When I learned that there were several channels on YouTube that read them aloud, I instantly subscribed to as many as I could find. I would eat through months, years of archives in one sitting, and with my headphones on, I felt immersed in a world of darkness that no horror movie could simulate. The creepypastas created a world in my mind that no Nightmare on Elm Street or House of a Thousand Corpses could rival. It seemed like, when I had time, I was always listening to them, ignoring anything else. That's when things started to get really bad. It started with insomnia. I was plagued with nightmares that would wake me up several times a night. I'd wake up, certain there was something in the bedroom with me, but a frantic sweep would find nothing except a grumpy wife being woken up yet again by my nightmares. It got to the point where I was lucky to get 5 hours of sleep a night, then 4 hours of sleep, then 2 if I was really lucky, then 2, but only if I took sleep aids or drank myself into oblivion. My wife made me go see a doctor. He put me on medication, but that didn't work either. Then, at her wit's end, she made me sleep on the couch. That only escalated my night terrors, though. That feeling of being watched got worse and worse, and I started seeing something out of the corner of my eye as I listened to my stories. As I sat awake, using the fear to keep myself from nightmares, I would see the shadowy something as it huddled in the corner. It would creep closer and closer, just out of my sight, but always in the peripherals, until I'd snap my head around, and it would vanish. I started having trouble at work. I was always tired and short with my coworkers. One day the boss told me just to not bother coming back. My wife was furious, finally told me that it was my family or the scary stories. We argued, but my heart really wasn't in it. I, too, had come to understand by then that the stories were the problem. The stories were keeping me awake. The stories were keeping me amped up. The stories were making me paranoid. I needed to work. I needed to be a father. So I did the only thing that made any sense. I gave them up. Cold turkey. At least, for a while. I lasted all of 2 months. Without the stories, I started to slip back into a normal routine. I was getting to sleep on time. My job let me come back on a trial period that quickly became permanent. My attitude improved, and I was once again the man I had always been. It's funny, though, how we forget what set us down the bad path once we're back in the light. It was just a little bit at first, on my phone at work, then after my wife went to bed, or when I was on the toilet, and slowly the night terrors came creeping back in. I had relapsed hard, and before I knew it, I was listening to them all the time again. That's when my wife took our son and left for her mother's house. The nightmares got worse, and suddenly I wasn't sleeping at all. My temper would flare unexpectedly, and that was the last straw for my newly returned job. My friends tried to help me, but I became moody and unpredictable. Soon they stopped coming around too. I started drinking again, drinking to black out, to feel a few moments of blissful oblivion. My wife filed for divorce, unable to help me, and unwilling to watch me kill myself with these stupid stories. My parents stopped calling, agreeing with my wife that if I wouldn't stop on my own, they didn't want anything to do with me. Then, one day, I realized the stories were all I had left. Or so I thought. About a year ago, the stories weren't enough. I could see the thing in the corner of my eye more and more often, stalking me. One day, for no reason at all, I started writing my own stories. I'd never been a writer, far from it, but the act of writing worked as its own kind of talisman against the creature. Writing them seemed to keep them at bay, seemed to get the darkness out of me, and for a while things got better. I was getting 5 hours of sleep again. I was feeling better than I had in a long time, but the writing became just as much of a mania as the reading. The divorce proceedings went badly for me. She got the house, of course, and child support, and a lot of other things I would have fought for once. I didn't care. None of it mattered to me. All I cared about was the thing in the corner of the courtroom that kept growling and pacing. All I wanted to do was get this over with so I could get home to my writing. I moved out, went back to the condo we used to live in, and took odd jobs to keep the bills paid. I've sold blood, sperm, written terrible things for terrible people, and all to feed my addiction. I'm no better than some smack addict, no better than some worthless junkie who writes his fix every day. My wife keeps calling me, asking when I plan to see our son, who keeps asking where his daddy is. But I don't have time for them. I have to write. I have to keep this beast at bay. But now, even the writing has stopped working. The thing isn't in the corner of my eye anymore. I can see him now. He's not even trying to hide. I'm afraid that he's very close to having me. God forgive me. He's stalking forward right now, and I can see his paws or feet or whatever they are as they make little divots in the carpet. I can smell his rancid breath as he grins with his lipless mouth full of teeth. So, what's the point of this then? Why write a creepypasta about creepypastas? For some kind of macabre immortality within a world I once loved? To have one more hurrah before the end? No. I'm writing this for you, for the ones who may be reading this after I'm gone. Always remember, if you remember nothing else, that these tales are spun from darkness. That the thing you feel watching you when you create fear is real. It can and will get you if you let it. While you stare long into the abyss, know that it stares hungrily back at you. His face is inches from my throat now. I can finally identify the brimstone in his breath. I think my time might be up. There it was again. Jeremy put his hands over his ears and tried to block the noise out, but the scratching against the hardwood sent chills up his spine. Stop it! Stop it right now! Jeremy clapped his hands over his mouth, terrified at what he had just done. The scratching under his bed had been happening for 3 weeks. The scratching, the weird noises, and sometimes he thought he heard whispers and whimpers amongst the odd sounds. His parents had said, "Oh, you're just dreaming," or "It's just the house settling." But Jeremy knew that it was something. There was something under there. He knew it in that way that children always know. The scratching stopped, and he lay there, silently shivering with the covers pulled up to his chin. He had done it now. Now it would slink out from under his bed and eat him up. It would come towering out from under the bed and hurt him with its long claws, or... "Who's there?" said a small voice that was trying to be brave. Jeremy jumped. That had been a child's voice. The thing under his bed had spoken, and it was a kid, like him. He peeked over the edge of the bed, expecting yellow eyes or a mouthful of pointy teeth, but no one peeked out from under his bed. After a few seconds of heavy silence, Jeremy decided to be brave for a little while longer. I'm Jeremy Bird. Why have you been under my bed all these nights making noise?" "Me? You're the terrifying thing that's been making noise under my bed this whole time," said the voice. To Jeremy, it sounded terrified. "No, I haven't," Jeremy said, and he laughed at the absurdity. "Oh, yes, you have. You growl and roar deep in the night. I've heard you," said the monster, who was blustering with angry terror. Jeremy thought for a moment. Does it sound like this? He pretended to snore. He'd gotten pretty good at it. If he wanted to trick his parents, they could stay up a little later. The monster quailed in terror. "Oh no, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "Shh, that's the noise I make when I sleep, silly," Jeremy said with a laugh. "Oh," said the monster, relieved. But what about that terrible squealing you make?" it added suspiciously. Jeremy thought about it, and as he thought, he leaned back on the bed, and the springs creaked and groaned. It chills me every time I hear it," said the monster with real terror. "That's just the mattress," Jeremy said. He was becoming less afraid of this monster, as it proved to be more fearful of him. "Well, what about those little noises you make at night? They're so invasive, they make me want to scream." Jeremy thought, what could the creature be talking about? He looked at the glow of the dark stars on his ceiling as he contemplated, and smiled as he remembered how his mom had pasted them up there. What small noises late at night could this creature be talking about? He thought, and his silence made the monster cry a little, a high-pitched whine at the back of his throat that made Jeremy cringe. Those are whimpers," Jeremy realized suddenly, understanding the noise as soon as he heard it. "Why do you make that sound?" the monster asked, but Jeremy already knew the answer. "Because I'm scared of you," he said, feeling a tear slip down his cheek as he lay in his bed, a child's fear coming over him that his parents would never understand, and because no one believes me. There was silence for a minute. "I'm sorry," said the monster in a small little voice. Jeremy felt himself smile a little. "It's okay. I don't think you meant to scare me. It's just in your..." No, not for that. Well, I am sorry for that, but I'm more sorry for what's about to happen to you." Jeremy tensed. "What do you mean?" "Well, I had 2 monsters, the one in my closet and you. When I told the closet monster I was more afraid of you than him, he told me that he could make you go away. He told me that if I distracted you, he'd catch you off guard and make sure you never scared me again." Jeremy was silent. "I'm sorry. Please, won't you forgive me?" Jeremy didn't answer. "Hello? Are you still there? Please don't be mad at me. I'm sorry." But Jeremy would never answer. The only sound to be heard was the soft drip on the floor and the closet door scratching as it was pulled shut from the inside. I've been an artist for a few years now. I went to school with people whose understanding of art stopped at watercolors and still lifes, but those never really were my thing. I like to be experimental in my work, really push the boundaries of art. My high school art teacher, Mr. Caff, never really understood that, but it's probably hard to understand much of anything with your head firmly crammed up your backside. He was one of those types who thought the Renaissance was the birth and death of the artistic expression, and that digital art was tantamount to blasphemy. He did not tolerate modern art in his classroom, and I likely wouldn't still be doing art if it wasn't for Terry. Terry and I met in art class freshman year, and we've been friends ever since. Terry is your textbook manic pixie dream girl, and her artistic medium is pop art, with a soft spot for comics. She did all those reimaginings of classic comic covers, always in heavy oils and deep, saturated colors, and her work is really something to behold. Mr. Caff may not have understood her medium, but he understood her process, so she made straight B's in his class. I have a theory that he was trying to get into her ripped blue jeans, but manic pixie dream girls rarely fall for the middle-aged high school teacher, so tough break, Teach. The old bastard tried to fail me, on the other hand, but I rose above it, and now I'm one of the most well-known modern artists in the city, likely to his chagrin. My art is far from what you'd consider classical. I make sculptures from various mediums, do charcoal prints, weird displays of paints and acrylics, and recently I've begun doing metalwork sculptures in something I'm calling transitory mundane. The basic premise is that you take something normal, a refrigerator or a couch or a TV, and make it utterly mind-blowing. My horror fridge took first place at last year's Fall Gala, and my TV Apocalypse made the paper earlier this year. This time, however, I've got something really interesting in mind. Terry raised an eyebrow as I pulled the cover off my latest art project. I call it the Infinity Table. Terry looked dubiously at the rectangular living room table, a thick piece of glass sitting propped over a dark opening. It just looks like a regular table to me. I'm not sure what kind of concept you're going for, but I don't get it. I grinned as I leaned down, flicking a switch as the inside lit up to reveal the trick. Through mirror placement and strategic lighting, the inside of the table resembles nothing so much as a black pit that proceeds downward into infinity. A ladder was installed on the side and seemed to descend down into the pit. The mirror magnified it on and into the void. Terry's jaw dropped open as she oohed appreciatively over the illusion. The rocks on the walls and the crystal lighting, a really nice touch if I do say so myself. That is so cool! It's so simple yet intriguing. Everyone's going to want one after the show next week. But only one of them will get it. I think this may be my greatest art piece yet. The two of us cackled over my brilliance, and Terry told me about the panel series she planned to do for her own entry. Terry had been hard at work on an original comic series, so tired of bringing others' works to life and not getting to work on her own stuff. She was debuting a series of oil paintings from her own personal collection, and she hoped they would drum up some interest for upcoming series. I was listening, really I was, but my eyes kept being drawn back down to that yawning chasm that lay in the center of the table. It was an illusion. I knew it was an illusion. I had made it after all. But I couldn't keep myself from feeling the sightless black eye as it stared at me. It had discomforted me before, the way a scary movie makes you shiver even after it's over. But I always managed to shrug it off. I had created the illusion. I knew it wasn't real, but I could still swear that something lurked within it. I knew it didn't, but it still intrigued me. I was like a bird that knows the bag will trap him, but still wants to know what lies inside. Like a man who knows that the void stares back, but goes right on staring. Hello? Are you even listening to me? I shook myself back and apologized for spacing out. I flipped the light out on the table, and it was once again reduced to a black crater. Even turned off, I still felt like I could feel that inky mass looking at me, and I didn't like the crawling, scrabbling way it seemed to contemplate me. It had never looked at me like this during its creation, and it seemed to have gained a life of its own with its completion. It's cool and all, but I'm kinda glad you turned it off. I looked up as Terry shuddered, and the discomfort was an alien concept on her normally whimsical face. It scares me a little bit. I smiled, but I knew all too well what she meant. That's why Terry was my best friend. It was sometimes like we shared a brain. How did you even come up with something like this? She asked, still sounding equal parts terrified and amazed. I started to rattle off something about pure talent or the muse at work, but I honestly couldn't remember how I had thought of it. Had it been in a dream? It seemed like I had been inspired by something to build this piece, but I couldn't remember what. I had been so driven the last few weeks to finish it that I never really stopped to think why. "Hello? You spacing out on me again?" Terry laughed, snapping her fingers in front of my face. I shook my head, getting a grip before answering. "Just the muse at work, I guess." I took her out for drinks then, wanting to forget about the feeling that dark eye had given me, as much as she did, but it was never far from my mind. When I stumbled back that night, the few drinks turning into a few too many drinks, I stood over the table and looked down into the dark, unlit eye. Even drunk, I felt the regard of that hateful space, and it sobered me a little. I could feel it staring at me through the flimsy haze that lay between us, and the dark hole seemed to long for its freedom again. I reached for the switch with a shaky hand, the mechanism snapping crisply as it came to life. The light came on, but it was cold comfort. The hole stretched into the earth, a dark and gaping maw that filled me with dread. Why had I created this thing? How did it occur to me to make such a hateful portal? How had I conceptualized this? The longer I looked into it, the more certain I became that I could see something at the bottom. It seemed to move within the dark eye, with frantic, herky-jerky movements. It moved like something in a claymation cartoon, and its regard was like wasps crawling on my skin. I didn't know what it was, couldn't even tell you how big it was, but as my hands trembled back towards the switch, I saw one thing for sure. It had begun to climb the ladder. The light snapped off with a smart pop, and I was left once more with only the dark haze across the glass. I went to bed, but my dreams were plagued by that bottomless eye and that thing that moved within. I didn't turn it on again until the day of the show. I honestly debated just pushing it into an alley behind my apartment and forgetting it ever existed, but I had too much time and money invested in the project to just walk away. The components hadn't come without a cost, and the prize money, not to mention the money I would make once it was sold, would allow me to do art for another few months. If it flopped at the show, I might have to actually find a job, and that would be the biggest blow to the art community imaginable. So I loaded it into the back of my ratty old pickup, the camper allowing it to ride in relative safety, and drove it to the gallery. I had secured it with a rope, not wanting it to tip over and break, despite my misgivings. I could tell myself that I kept checking the rear view the whole time just to make sure it wasn't getting damaged, but that was a lie. I wanted to make sure that nothing simply climbed out of it as I drove through the crowded streets of Seattle to what I hoped would be a feather in the cap of my career. My neighbor had helped me load the table. Beefy neighbors have to be good for something, right? And thankfully there were burly men in black security shirts to help me unload it. They did most of the unloading and reloading onto the hand dolly too, which was good because it had taken everything I had to put my hands on it as we loaded it into the truck. It had sat like a revered monolith in my living room for the past week. After I had woken up that first morning to a hangover and the sunlight illuminating the pit under that all-too-thin pane of glass, I had covered it with a tarp. I hadn't touched it, hadn't said anything on it, hadn't even let my feet lean against it the whole week, and the thought of its surface against my skin made me feel crawly. I couldn't remember why I had been so excited about this thing, and only a feeling of deep revulsion filled me when I looked at it. If no one bought it, I had decided I would donate it to the gallery after the show. At least I could write that off on my taxes. Terry waved at me as she saw me coming in, and her little bird arms seemed ready to pop as she wrapped them around me. "I see you didn't get rid of it," she said with a smile, though her voice sounded strained. Terry wouldn't say so, but she seemed to feel the same trepidation I felt around the piece. I figured that someone would buy it, and who knows, the judges might really like it. She showed me her prints, scenes of dramatic heroes poised for battle, and spiraling cityscapes that oozed adventure, and I made the appropriate noises over them. It was always impressive what she could do with oils and paints, but tonight she had really outdone herself. I gave her another hug, wishing her luck as I pushed my hateful table over to the area that had been designated for me. A passing pair of lost frat boys helped me get it off the dolly, and far too soon I was left alone with this blight upon the world. I didn't turn it on. I honestly didn't really want to look at it, and I just contented myself to stand there as people bustled by and set up their own pieces for the show. 20 minutes later, my mind wandering, someone called my name, and I turned to find a stern-faced woman looking down at my piece. "What is it?" she asked, a ribbon on her shirt letting me know that, though she wasn't a judge, she was still very important. The ribbon let everyone know that she was a contributor, the color putting her in a high tier. "It's called an infinity table," I told her, her scowl not impressed. I reached down, my fingers trembling, and flipped the switch. I expected to see an angry something looking back at me, the glass bearing long cracks where something had battered it from the other side. But instead, it was just the same dark eye as always. It regarded the two of us with an unfriendly familiarity, and the stern-looking woman looked impressed as she took it all in. Very interesting. Not my style, but very interesting. You should leave it on if you want anyone to buy it. The endless tunnel is a definite selling point. I waited for her to move away before switching it off again. She had a point. If I wanted to get rid of this hateful thing, I needed people to see what it could do. The fear of something climbing out of it seemed silly now, as all these people stood around me, but it was a silly feeling that wouldn't abate. In the end, my greed overrode my fear, and I flipped it on so I could draw in some interest. Interest I found. People came over to have a look, and there was a fair amount of oohing and awing. They asked how I had done it, wanted one of their own, but I told them it was a one-of-a-kind piece and would likely carry a steep price tag. All the while, my eyes kept flitting back to the crevice in the center of the table, as though I expected to see something crawl up from the depths. I could see, or at least I imagined I could see, the stunted figure as he stalked about at the bottom of the pit. It was trapped there. This was its prison, and now I had given it a means of escape. I had invited it out of the pit, and now it could come into our world, and wow, how did you ever come up with something so cool? I started. Someone new had come up to ask about the infinity table, and I told them again about the concept. It all sounded so false to me now. I hadn't come up with the concept, though I could certainly talk about it in an educated manner. What a smart little bird I was. I could talk oh so prettily about my new project, using all the right buzzwords and trendy lingo to catch all these yuppies' attention. I was an artist. I created art, but I was beginning to feel like something else. This was beginning to feel like I was being used. Despite these misgivings, the show was going pretty well. People loved the infinity table. They thought it was really cool, and a great perspective piece. I had a few tentative offers, but nothing serious. I would have probably taken the first offer, but the hole in the table kept distracting me. As I talked to people, I could see the small something beginning to climb the ladder again. It was still very small, like a fly crawling on a window pane, but as it climbed, it got larger and larger with each rung it grabbed. There was no way this could be real. I had built the thing. There was no hole in the void. It was all an optical illusion. Even so, the small creature was climbing up and up and up as these stupid airheads talked on and on about how much they loved my table. "Hey, you okay?" I jumped, realizing I'd been staring at the table for nearly 5 minutes. Terry was there, a well-dressed man grinning on her arm. Terry wasn't tall, but this guy looked like he might have had some hobbits in his family tree. He was short, hairy, dressed in a luxury white suit with a gold chain and a lot of very aggressive chest hair. I wasn't certain I could smell him. There were a lot of sweaty bodies, mine chief among them, but there was a definite tang of musky cologne and fragrant soap. Terry was smiling, but the smile looked paper-thin as the man, whom I was already calling Leisure Suit Larry in my head, rubbed his arm against her hip. "This is Clive," she said, indicating Larry as she slid herself free of him. "He liked my art so much that he decided to buy all 5 pieces. I just knew he had to see your infinity table, so I brought him over here to have a look." Translation, Leisure Suit Larry was Loaded Larry, and she was hoping she could solve both our problems. Larry had sized me up as she spoke, and I could feel my skin crawl under his less than altruistic stare. "I consider myself a lover of art, amongst other things. Did you make this?" he asked, looking down into the table as his eyes seemed to dazzle as they took in the sight of the gaping pit. "I did," I began, but before I could say anything else, I looked down at the table and felt my throat constrict. He was bigger now, the size of a thumbprint, and climbing fast. He was speeding up, climbing rapidly, and I wasn't sure how the others couldn't see him. Did they not see the shadowy little creature as it grew from a thumbprint to the size of a silver dollar? Larry was saying something, complimenting my work, but all I could focus on was the growing spot of black as it climbed like a mad thing. "I'm sold, love," he said to Terry, the word love making her flinch. "I'll pay you 30,000 for it." I couldn't speak. My throat was a stupid machine, incapable of doing anything but killing me slowly. The thing was twice as large now, growing quickly. I had no clue what I would do if it got to the glass and just started banging on that thin sheet of tempered material. Larry was looking right at it, his nose inches from the tabletop. How could he not see it? Playing hard to get, huh? Okay, 40,000 then. I could make out the top of its head, its face turned up to look at the land above. Its eyes were like twin coals, its mouth open in a leering grin, and its hands were covered in hair or tar or something. Its body was like an undiluted shadow, a golem of darkness that was climbing like a fiend to get at the lighted world above. It seemed like I might have unintentionally created performance art, I thought with a weak little gasp. Escape from purgatory in real life. Terry slid her hand into mine and squeezed, bringing me out of my panic. "What's wrong?" she whispered, seeing my face and sensing my fear. "You're a tease, aren't you?" Larry said, looking up from the table coyly. "Fine, but 50,000 is as high as I'll go unless you agree to have drinks with me after the show. Then I might be willing to go up to 60. "Sold," I squeaked out, afraid he would take it all back and leave me with this thing. He extended a hand over the table. As I shook it, I could see the creature's face coming closer and closer to the top. I pumped his arm twice before bending down to snap the light off. Can you take it now?" I asked him, my voice sounding frantic even to my own ears. "Don't you want the judges to see it?" Terry asked, a little confused. The panel of 3 judges were just coming to the display area, but I didn't want this thing close to me for more than a second. The hell with the judges. The fear inside me was like a starving weasel, and I feared it would burst through my chest any minute. "Can you?" I asked again, looming over him. He nodded dumbly, taking out his checkbook and scrawling out a business check. I took it, and he pulled out his cell phone as he made some calls. He excused himself, and before Terry could ask any more questions, I pocketed the check and left the gallery. I met her later for drinks, and she said Larry had excused himself after the purchase. He said he wanted to get it loaded and set up in his own exhibition right away. I think you scared him with your intensity a little. We laughed about it then, my soul lighter now that I didn't have to look at that hateful table anymore. I hadn't thought about that table until yesterday, about a week and a half after the gala. The check had been cashed, and the money had easily floated my art career for the next few years. I'd paid some bills, paid my outstanding credit card debt, and began living pretty comfortably off the excess. I was sitting on my couch, watching Netflix and eating a bowl of cereal for dinner, when my phone buzzed. It was Terry. She had sent me a news article along with a message telling me that I should watch it. "Your art piece just made the news in New York," she told me, and the lack of emojis and lols made me a little wary. I opened it up to find an article about a murder at the gallery of Clive Foreman. The proprietor, Mr. Foreman, had been found dead in his gallery in Soho Tuesday morning. He appeared to have been drowned, though no water could be found in his lungs or on the ground around him. Doctors say it's as though he simply drowned on the floor of his gallery and was left there. The next picture was of a very familiar table. It had been broken, and the glass lay gaping and jagged like an untreated wound. The article went on to say that the murderer had left a message on the wall in either tar or some kind of oil, and as I scrolled to the next picture, I felt the phone slip out of my numb hand. The message on the wall seemed to glower at me from the floor, and I drew my knees up to my chest as I tried to make myself stop hyperventilating. It read, "Your muse is free. My prison is no more."
Tonight, Dr. Plague reads, "It took our socks. Enjoy."
I shouldn't have cared so much. They were just socks after all. But it was becoming such a problem. We moved into our house about 3 months ago, our first real house. I honestly thought this was going to be a fresh start for my wife, my daughter, and I. We've been bumping around from place to place since Lisa was born, and we'd lived in a new home every year since she was a year old. It had nothing to do with our landlords or rowdy neighbors or paranormal happenings, as is often the case in these kind of stories. Her mother and I simply kept getting better jobs, which required us to move from one side of town to the other for work. That kind of moving made it hard for Lisa to make any friends or feel comfortable in any place she knew, since she knew she just had to pack up and leave again soon. After 8 years of moving around and never fully unpacking, my wife and I gained some level of job stability. I was a junior VP with the company I worked at, and my wife had become a manager at the store where she worked. This meant the money was steady, the job was consistent. We decided it was time for something a little more permanent. We started house hunting right away, and after a few weeks, we stumbled across what we thought was our dream home. It was less than 30 minutes from both my office and her store, a bus ride away from school for our daughter, positioned out of town so as not to deal with the constant noise of the big city, and a big backyard with plenty of room for our growing family. As I look back on it now, I never would have expected what came next. We'd been in the house for less than a week when I first started noticing the socks were missing. "Honey, have you seen my black dress socks?" I was standing in the laundry room, looking into the dryer like I expected my missing sock to just appear out of thin air. My wife walked onto our back porch to see what I was talking about, her bathrobe replaced with a work uniform. I should have left for work 10 minutes ago. I would miss my carpool at this rate. But there I stood with one sock on and one bare foot. I had searched under, around, and on top of the dryer for the missing sock, and had finally started looking into the empty dryer like an utter fool. My wife said she hadn't seen it, but wondered if I'd seen the fluffy pink socks she liked to wear to work. "I'm missing the left one," she said good-naturedly, but I could tell she wasn't pleased about it. We both shrugged it off at the time. We had just moved in, and there were still boxes to unpack. We figured our socks had just gotten lost in the shuffle. As the first month went on, however, and the boxes slowly became less and less, we found it off-putting that we hadn't seen any of our missing socks. Quite the contrary. I was now missing 12 socks out of 15 pairs that I owned. This wasn't such a huge deal for me. I owned 15 pairs of business dress socks that went with my suits, and I could easily match them together. My wife, on the other hand, was fuming because she was missing some of the cute socks she liked to wear to work. Not just our socks. Lisa's socks were missing too. Not to mention that Lisa hadn't been sleeping well since we moved into the new house. Since the first night, she'd been woken up in the wee hours of the morning by a strange noise outside our window. She never saw what made the noise. It never poked a grisly maw up over the windowsill to scare her, but she said it sounded like fingernails scratching along the side of the house. I went and looked too, and there were definitely scratch marks on the bricks outside her window. They were going up towards the kitchen and maybe towards the laundry room. I put it off at the time and made a note to trim the tree branches the next time I was doing yard work. We had quite a few large oaks in the backyard, and their branches did hang pretty low to the ground. Other than the socks and the noise, Lisa loved her new house. She had friends over to play in the big backyard and had a huge room for all her toys and games, a bathroom all to herself. She would always follow every puffy-eyed morning up with, "But I still love the house, Dad. Please don't make us move," no matter how many times I assured her that this was our house now and we weren't going anywhere. Sitting in the bedroom now with all of them clustered around me, I don't know if I still feel that way or not. About a month ago, the activity started to escalate. It was the holiday rush for the company I worked for. October, November, and December are big advertising months. I was working late, later than usual these days, to meet my deadline. I had been dozing at my desk, and I jumped one evening as the phone rang, not even realize what time it was. I looked at the clock and gasped when I realized it was almost 8:30. That would be Maggie, I thought, calling to make sure I was okay. Lisa would be in bed already, and Maggie would call to see if she needed to wait up for me or go to bed. Her store was experiencing the same holiday blitz as mine, and she would most likely relish the idea of rolling into unconsciousness until the alarm went off again. I caught the phone on the third ring. "Hello? David, please, I need you to come home now." It was Maggie, but she sounded funny. Not funny ha-ha, but funny scared. She was whispering into the phone, and in the background I could hear someone crying. I guessed that it must be Lisa. The two were likely in the bedroom, the farthest room in the house from anything, with the door locked and the windows drawn. Maggie, what's going on?
There's something on the back porch, she whispered. Something big. David, I need you to come home. I think it might be a prowler.
Okay, Maggie, I'm on my way. You two just sit tight, okay? I had already grabbed my briefcase and my coat and was heading out the door. I made the 23-minute drive in 10 minutes, and I was lucky I didn't see a single police officer. As I pulled into the front yard, I popped the trunk and took out one of the golf clubs I'd had in there since my last golfing trip. It was a big old sturdy driver, and I felt sure that it would be a force to be reckoned with, unless the prowler had a gun, of course. I moved around the side of the house, keeping my back against the wall as I went, and when I got to the back porch, I listened for the sound of something moving around. I'd put a heavy deadbolt on the door leading from the house to the back porch, and I was pretty confident that it was still on. As I listened, I heard something, and I tensed as I cranked my senses up to 11. It was a scuttling sound, like claws on asphalt, but it was also a weird sort of gloopy sound that was barely audible over the scraping and the clawing feet. I relaxed a bit, thinking it was probably just a raccoon or a possum, and stepped around the corner as I threw open the door and brandished the club. I expected to find an animal, a startled animal that would hiss and run away, but I was unprepared for what awaited me as I threw open the screen door and stepped out on the back porch. Nothing. There was nothing on my back porch, except for the storage boxes we kept out there and the washer and dryer. I looked around, moving the washer and dryer to see if anything had clawed its way behind it, but there was nothing to be found except some scrape marks on the tile. I decided there was a hole somewhere that a critter was getting in through. Upon further investigation, I discovered that the silver tube that hooked the dryer to the outflow was knocked off. I secured it and locked the screen door and went around to the front door to let my wife know that it was just a raccoon or something. She was far from satisfied with this explanation. It sounded way bigger than a raccoon, David. I'm sure I heard something out there. There are noises that Lisa keeps hearing, too. What if it's some pervert who's stealing our socks? Socks? Is that something that people really got off on? I asked. She wasn't amused. I'm serious, David. I want you to do something about this. So I did. I called a contractor and had him come look at the back porch. He couldn't find any way that something could be coming in, but he said he'd pest seal all the exit holes and suggested that I call a pest control company to put out some repellent and keep the critters away. I thought maybe this would stop the problem, but it only seemed to escalate it. Socks began missing at an alarming rate. 3 pairs in one night, 4 pairs in one night. By the end of the month, we'd be through 4 packs of dress socks. Maggie was putting a lot of pressure on me to solve this problem. I was getting angry. My work was beginning to suffer for lack of sleep and lack of focus. 2 days ago, I finally had enough. When I came home to find my sleep-deprived wife dozing on the back porch, all her laundry done during the day now, and having to sit with it to keep it safe, I knew something had to give. I took a week off work, citing stress at home and a need for rest. I staked out the back porch. I had purchased a jumbo-sized packing box, big enough for me to sit in and stake out the back porch to catch whatever was doing this. I was no longer convinced it was a critter, and the fact that everything was reset back the way I had left it in the morning told me it was a devious individual with a lot of experience at this particular pastime. I set up the box and put some snacks, some water bottles, and a gun that I had bought just for the occasion in one corner. I made myself comfortable, as comfortable as you can in a huge box, I guess, and settled in for the night with my phone out and my energy shots close at hand. I must have fallen asleep, because when I woke up, it was to the sound of scrabbly claws again. I peeked out from the box, expecting to see an animal or maybe a weird little man with a sack and a mask like in the manga I had read as a kid. But I did not expect to find what I found out there. My cell phone light shook as the creature came into focus. It was amorphous, like an oozing potato, with 6 long human-like arms coming out of its body. Each arm ended in a hand, and each hand ended in a finger. And each of the 6 fingers each had a little hand that were tipped with long, dirty nails. This was the sound I'd been hearing, the creature scuttling along on its long, dirty nails as it clicked across the back porch. It didn't see me right away. It had its head in the dryer. When it came out,
I could see a smooth and bloated head with no neck and a snarl of long, greasy black hair that looked like a wig. It held one of my daughter's socks in a 7th and 8th pair of hands. As it looked at it through watery black eyes, it reached into its body with the other hand and pulled out something. It pulled out what looked like a baby. It looked like an amorphous potato baby that squalled in a soft little gloopy way and waved feebly with its 8 stumpy arms. The creature took the sock and stretched the neck of it out before it placed the squalling thing inside it. The baby stopped glooping at once, making some watery burbles as the creature slid it back into its flesh. And as the creature turned to go, it finally caught sight of me. I saw it scamper towards the back of the dryer, somehow condensing itself to slip in and out again. As it pushed itself into that pipe, it finally saw my flashlight, and I saw the skinned back, 2 large jaws that dominated the front of its face. It looked like a weird Halloween mask, the ones that are a little too uncanny. It opened its mouth and made a sound like an angry river rushing up to swallow me. I shot it then. I rattled off 3 panicked shots before I could stop myself, and it stopped in its tracks and looked startled. I don't know if I hit it. I don't even know if my bullets could kill it, but I was so scared at that moment that I did the only thing my lizard brain determined was the right course of action. I ran. I flipped out of the box and ran, slamming the door behind me and throwing the bolt as something large and angry thundered against the other side. My wife was there then, pale and unsure, wanting to know what had happened. I turned her around and grabbed Lisa as she came sleepily up the hall. I pulled them all into the direction of the bedroom and locked the door behind us, pushing the chest of drawers in front of it. The police have come and gone now. I called 911 before I started writing this, but they couldn't find anything on the back porch. The officers figured that maybe a bear wandered up or something. They're supposed to be hibernating, but it happens sometimes. Their only real question was how it had gotten out without dropping a single drop of blood after being shot. The back porch is a disaster. It certainly wasn't worried about keeping a low profile this time. The police gave me the number to animal control and told me to call in the morning so they could have a look for the wounded bear. I'm not calling animal control, though. In the morning, we're going to pack up everything dear to us and just get the hell out of here. If that thing can fit through the hole in the laundry room, I have no idea how small it can squeeze. Since the police left, I can hear something outside the windows. I can hear those dirty fingernails as they scrape along the brick walls of the house. Could it squeeze through the crack under the front door? Could it come in through a sewer pipe? My family drifted off into a shallow sleep, but I'm sitting here on the bed, gun by my knee, just listening for the sounds. It stopped scraping its claws about 5 minutes ago. I don't know if that should be comforting or not. I wish I'd just let it keep the socks.
Have you ever met someone who changed your life so completely? Someone who's your first, your last, your only? I met her once. Her name was Sheela. I worked as an engineer in China. My company hired me straight out of college and offered me a substantial sign-on bonus if I would relocate to the mainland hub. Apparently, the company was responsible for many of the dams across China, and due to poor upkeep, many of the lawsuits leveled against them had been for machinery failure. My job was to check the machinery in the dams and make sure they were working correctly. It's a pretty lucrative job. After a few years, I find myself nearly fluent in the regional dialect. An American is something of a novelty for the people in these rural towns. I often find myself invited to bars or back to someone's house at the end of the day. The women have been very amicable, if not right out flirtatious. I usually don't find it difficult to find female companionship if I want it. Well, I didn't, at least. That was before I met Sheela, though. I was checking on a rather large dam near the coast, one that filters the often polluted river water and keeps debris from reaching the ocean. The dam's been leaking something caustic into the sea for a few months, and it was my job to figure out why it was doing that. I won't bore you with the technical details, but it wasn't hard to figure out what was going on. No one had bothered to dump the holding tanks that collect the pollutants, and they were leaking out into the dam walls and then into the ocean. No one had bothered to tell the workers to dump the tanks either. So a week of work and one pumper barge later, the dam was back up and keeping the ocean clean. That was apparently cause for celebration. The dam workers took me out for a few drinks that night. The local community, heavily centered around the fishing industry, wanted to meet me and thank me. A celebration was held, and I was introduced to everyone from the village mayor to the town priest. The mood was definitely festive, and I remember being handed a small cup of strong liquor early in. The clear liquor was quite potent, and after a while, the night became a jumble of colors and sounds. I danced and laughed and ate some of the best food I'd ever tasted. The whole village was so friendly that, after a while, I forgot to be self-conscious about my height or my nationality, and just let myself be immersed in the moment. I was sitting under an overhang, a fourth cup of the strong liquor at hand, when I saw a goddess approach me. Her hair was pale, not blonde, but white, and her dress was seafoam green and clung to her. She had the eye of every man there, and had the ire of every woman. I remember thinking that she didn't seem to fit the standards of this place. She was tall, almost as tall as me, and her skin was darker, tanned, brown. She looked foreign, vaguely Middle Eastern, and I remembered thinking that she looked like no one I'd ever seen before. She sauntered up to me, her eyes promising things her body was more than capable of keeping, and extended a hand to me. "Dance?" she asked, her voice gliding out like a midnight tide. I reached out, shakily, and took her hand. She pulled me up, not easy to do, considering I'm mostly muscle and 6'2". As the music started, she began to spin me and pull me in time with her own internal beat. We moved as galaxies moved, a solar system unto ourself, and when I looked at her, I could see her barely contained longing. She desired me. She wanted me. And when she pulled me close, I could feel her heart racing in her chest. Her breasts pressed against me through the dress, and her lips slid up my neck. I heard her whisper something in my ear that sent pins down my spine. "Come with me. Come with Sheela." She broke from me then, a teasing finger tempting me away from the dancers. I stumbled after her, the drink and the fire in my nethers piloting me easily. Did you say Sheela? Is that your name?" I slurred, letting her lead me towards the beach. She smiled and kept crooking her finger at me as we left the festivities. She led me through the sprawl of the little dwellings that butted up against the sea, and in my drunken state, I was in no mood to think about what I might be doing. Her pale hair danced in the moonlight, and her tan skin shone so pale it was almost white. It turned her into a ghost, floating along before me as I stumbled on the rutted path. She beckoned me onward, and as I came, I could hear some exotic melody floating around us in the air. Then the dog began to bark, and the melody was snatched away. He wasn't much of a guard dog, some little mutt that had been tied up in someone's yard, but the effect he had on her was jarring. She recoiled as though she had been burned, and took a few shaky steps away from the animal. The dog was lunging at her, straining against its rope, and snarling like a wild thing. He was choking himself trying to get free, and his aggressive behavior seemed aimed solely at my companion. Watching him maul the air was starting to bring me out of my daze. Then Sheela rounded on him and hissing at him like a scalded cat. The dog yarked and backpedaled to hunker under the porch, completely chastised. When she crooked her finger at me, the lovely music began to take me away again. We came to the beach, and she led me to a spot behind a stand of vegetation. There sat a hand-carved wooden boat bobbing in the surf. As I climbed inside, I felt the weight of the drink descend on me. I closed my eyes and felt the boat slip off into the waves. My fingers splashed into the spray when they took to the water, and I remember thinking that we were moving much too fast for a boat she was paddling. I'd seen no motor, and the boat looked like the kind that you would need big oars and strong arms to pilot. As we bobbed and floated in the churning soup, I let my mind focus on the strange music enveloping me, and drifted off for what couldn't have been longer than a few minutes. When I awoke, we were on a very different stretch of sand, and her hands were pressed against my chest, her face very close to mine. She smiled when she saw that I was awake. "Come," she whispered, and was off me and out of the boat with a cat-like grace. I rose from the boat much less gracefully, and as I looked across the water, I could see the lights of the little fishing village many miles away. I looked for the oars, but I didn't see them. I must have been out for hours, because there was no way she could have gone that far in a few minutes. The little boat bobbed in the shallows, having no anchor and no means to stay put either, and that confused me as well. Surely the tide must take it back out again without something to tie it down. Then the warm laughter of my guide and the soft music enveloped me again, and I followed her into the woods. A lush jungle lay not far from the boat, and she was standing at the edge and looking lovely in her green dress. She moved into the tree line, begging to be chased, and in the light of the moon, I dogged her steps as my drink-soaked brain processed only the need to have her. The jungle vegetation was lush and thick. On any other night, I would have been hesitant to plunge into there for fear of snakes or poisonous insects. That night, though, I blundered in with wild abandon, and the deeper I went, the deeper I was pushed to go. When I crashed into a small clearing, a burbling pool splishing placidly, I looked around wildly. She was nowhere to be seen, but I could still hear the music, and I knew she couldn't be far. Suddenly, the burbling became a loud expulsion of water, and she rose from the water like a nymph. I must have looked ghastly myself, one shoe missing, clothes torn and tattered from my wild run, and my face awash with mud and sweat. She approached me, however, as though I were some Greek god. She slid her soft hands over my cheek and pressed her cool lips against mine. She tasted exotic, like oils and spices and something unknown. She tasted like the grave, but I wouldn't know that until later. She broke our kiss and slid her mouth to my ear as she whispered her last request. "Dance for me." I felt my limbs go taut, like a puppet whose strings have been pulled, and suddenly I broke into a wild and frantic sort of dancing. The music in my head changed, becoming primal and dissident. My body threw itself wildly about. My throat erupted in earthy screams of ecstasy. I felt like one of those ravers in a mosh pit as my body danced out its primal need for her. She sat back against a rock, her dress hiking up to show me a pale leg that I was sure had been tanned earlier. Hadn't she looked exotic before? Vaguely Middle Eastern? Now her skin was pale as cream, and her white hair seemed brittle and corpsey as the moon spilled across it. Her dress suddenly seemed more like a funeral shift, and the green became mold as her cat-like eyes stared at me in the throes of my passionate dancing. I was a beast, a man on fire, and as I danced, I felt my limbs exerting themselves to the limits. My legs gave way first, spilling me head first onto the dirt. I rolled over, my arms still trying to dance, and I saw her creep forward like something from a horror movie. She scuttled ghoulishly, on all fours, and my limbs refused to heed any of the commands I was giving them. My legs twitched, trying to dance, but unable, and my arms kept thrashing and hitching feebly as she approached. I could see her staring at me from the soles of my feet as she peeked at me from between my toes. Then she opened her mouth very wide and popped the big toe of my left foot into her mouth. When she opened her mouth, I had seen a double row of sharp teeth that promised to strip my flesh even as they bit through the bone. As the toe entered her mouth, I knew I would never see it again. When she sucked the toe instead, I thought maybe I'd been mistaken. Perhaps she was just playing with me. Maybe the alcohol had made me hallucinate, and this was nothing but a gin-soaked dream. Then she bit the toe, parting it from my body as she chewed with an ecstatic look on her cannibal's face. I cried out, but my cries mixed well with the dance's primal scream. No one would hear me out here anyway. We were miles from civilization. Even the fishermen on their boat that might be close would probably think I was a strange night bird. No one was coming to my rescue, and my body had betrayed me in the wake of the strange song. I was her plaything, her prisoner, and she could do with me as she liked. The other 4 toes of that foot went down simultaneously. She crunched them with relish, her serpentine tongue sliding out to lick the blood from her lips. When the toes were gone, she took a bite of the now oddly shaped foot. The blood ran darkly from the nub, and she lapped at it hungrily as she chewed. My throat felt raw from screaming, the pain intense and throbbing, and as she took a second bite, I heard my voice giving out from crying. She looked up at me, seductively enough to make certain parts of my body quiver and began planting biting kisses up my leg. The wounds were red and oozing, her lips now painted in my blood, and as she bit her way up, I began to realize her destination. I tried to break free of her spell, not wanting to be parted from that particular portion of my body, but I was helpless before her. She kissed her way up my leg, her mouth splitting and the cheeks ripping at the corners as she prepared to bite through the front of my trousers. Then a dog howled somewhere in the jungle, and she cast her eyes fearfully towards it. She stared in the direction for nearly a minute, seeming unsure of herself. She was rattled. The dog's howl had put her off, just like the one on the mainland had. She stared out into the forest, eyes searching frantically. When nothing came running out of the jungle to challenge her, though, she turned back to her helplessly dancing victim. I'll save you the gory details. Needless to say, it was the worst pain of my life. I watched her throat bulge as she swallowed them down, a look of pure bliss on her face. My warm blood pattered down her placid face as she closed her eyes and basked in the taste of me. She looked up then, cat eyes searching, and I thought she might be seeing my heart as it beat in my chest. She licked the blood from her lips and stalked up my chest, grabbing my arms and holding them down fiercely, so my feebly swinging arms couldn't hinder her. Her mouth tore open at the corners again, and I closed my eyes against the oncoming rip of her two sharp teeth. The various wounds ached and bled, and at that moment I was almost glad that it was about to end. I just wanted the pain to stop. That's when I heard the howl, closer now than it had been, and something big slammed into her side. It knocked her off me, sending her squealing and hissing and driving her weight off of my hurting body. When I opened my eyes, I realized that it wasn't a dog at all. It was a wolf, a big black wolf with white snarling teeth and a pair of piss-yellow eyes that looked furious. My mind was a jumble. I didn't remember hearing about wolves in China, but I was far from upset by his sudden appearance. He leapt onto the woman and tore into her with his snarling maw. She hissed at him, slapping at him with her long nails, but as she showed some signs of driving him off, another wolf barreled from the jungle to join the first. As I lay bleeding, 8 of the largest wolves I had ever seen came snarling from the vegetation to ring her in. She looked at them. As her eyes met with mine, her face was full of fear. They buried her in a ring of ripping teeth and furry bodies. I didn't waste time. I dragged myself away from the clearing with what little strength I had left, making for the beach that had been so close when I had 2 whole feet. As I pulled myself away, I could hear them tearing and ripping at her, her screams driving into my brain like an ice pick. If you've never heard someone get mauled to death by a pack of wolves, consider yourself very lucky. I could hear them savaging her as I bled and crawled, and I had no illusions of getting far before they fell on me as well. I was leaving a clear enough blood trail and panting loud enough to be heard from the mainland. As the sounds of their feast became farther away, I began to think I might be allowed to die in the jungle instead of eaten alive by wolves. I had no hope of finding the beach again. I only knew that I didn't want to die as she had. When my fingers sank into the sand an undeterminable amount of time later, I drew them back in surprise. I had never expected to find the beach, and now that the sound of water engulfed me, I knew I might be allowed to die on the beach in relative comfort. I dug my body out onto that beach, my various injuries crying out as the sand caked them and was ground into them. I dragged myself forward until I could feel the shore's wet edge, and then rolled onto my back and lay where the water might slide up and touch me as I was dying. It was cold fire against my injured foot, but I didn't care. The sound of waves would be a perfect backdrop for my last few minutes on Earth. I could still feel the blood leaking out of my foot and crotch, and knew I had lost a lot of it. I closed my eyes and prepared to die, when my eyelids were suddenly blasted by a bright light. I thought it was the sun for one pain-soaked moment. I thought I had fallen into a pain-induced shock and come to the beach by day, but when the lights went away, I opened my eyes in confusion. The light returned a moment later, and I shaded my eyes to see it wasn't the sun, but a searchlight. As it slid away, I saw it was on a little ship that was cruising towards the coast. When I flopped back down and closed my eyes again, it fell on me and it held me in its regard. I heard people yelling, speaking in the native tongue, and there was a splash of boats being lowered into the water. I tried to struggle when they came for me, fearing that they were with her, but my body had reached its limits. I blacked out as the strong hands lifted me from the sand. The last thing I remember was feeling my back on the hardwood and wondering if it would be the last thing I ever felt. I woke up on the mainland, though. I had been asleep for 3 days. The doctors told me that some fishermen from the village had heard me screaming and come to see if they could help. My left foot was 60% gone. My left leg was in danger of needing amputation since some of the bites had festered. My groin was a tube now. My reproductive organs were bitten off completely, and I was fortunate to be alive. Any longer, and you would have likely bled to death. As I lay in the clean white hospital room, being told I would likely lose my leg and had lost the thing that at my age made me a man, I didn't feel so fortunate. The police came and asked me questions about what had happened, but you could tell they didn't believe me. The island I had been found on was private property, a nature preserve, and no one in the area ever went there for fear of the animals that lived there. They sounded like they thought I was a weirdo, some sex freak that had gone a little too far, and when I told them that the wolves had eaten the woman who had done this, they scoffed. If the fishermen in the village hadn't corroborated my story about leaving with a woman, they would have likely assumed I had done this to myself. I'd still be in the dark if the old man hadn't come to visit. He told me his name was Lee, and he had been one of the fishermen who had found me on the island. They had left the party after his brother had told them who I had gone off with. He said I was fortunate to be alive. Many people who ran across the Sheela were not so lucky. The what? I asked. Sheela. They are old creatures that live on the island. They are spirits, he said, trying to find the words to explain it. Not like our spirits, but still spirits. They come from the union of a spirit of air and a human. They feed on human flesh and love to entice their prey to a secluded area so they can extend their time with them. You said creature. You mean there are more of them? I asked, horrified. He nodded. We lose men to the island sometimes. Many villages do. Like you, some come back scarred and broken, saved by the wolves who hate the Sheela. You are very lucky, son. Never forget that. I lay back in bed, cold and wanting to throw up, thinking of others who had been lured to the island and devoured by that hateful thing. That was 2 weeks ago. The doctors say I will get to keep my leg, but there's nothing they can do about my situation below the belt. My company has offered to pay my hospital bills and sent over paperwork for a sizable settlement if I don't pursue any legal action for being hurt on the job. I told them I hadn't been injured on the job, but they don't seem to want to take any chances. The settlement will be more than enough to get home and start some semblance of a new life. I can't do what I used to do with one foot, so that part of my life is clearly behind me. So many things are behind me now. I tell my story not to elicit pity, but to warn those who might travel to this part of the world. Be careful who you follow home. That pretty face might hide some sharp teeth, and you might find yourself following your date back to her lair. There are Sheela out there still, and I can attest that their hunger and their cruelty are not like anything you've ever seen before. Be careful, and don't be her next victim.